Imagine the scene. I am standing ankle-deep in foul, black muck in a spot that, a mere 72 hours prior, was a pristine 47-acre lake. The metallic ring of my sledgehammer reverberates over a panorama resembling an extraterrestrial world, with fissured ground extending as far as the eye can see. Strewn about like beached leviathans across this desolate landscape are $24 million boats. Their once immaculate white hulls are now stained brown from decades of sludge from the lakebed. The odor assails you in waves. Decaying fish, diesel, and an aroma that is alarmingly similar to raw sewage. Some 300 yards off, Brenda Kelworth, the HOA matriarch who initiated this conflict, is yelling into her phone as she sprays down parched swimming pools. Her luxury resort patrons are packing their luggage and insisting on refunds, while bass and bluegill fight for life in silted puddles. 3 months back, Brenda had the bridge my grandfather constructed in 1952 demolished, labeling it an eyesore. Well, Brenda, how does your $2 million eyesore appear now? But before I detail how I lawfully emptied an entire lake, what would you do if someone were to bulldoze your family's heritage while you were in the middle of your father's burial? Leave a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. Let's see the reach of this tale of vengeance. My name is Marcus Henley, and 3 months ago, I was nothing more than a divorced mechanical engineer attempting to piece my life back together. At 47, my marriage had ended. I was in a battle for weekend custody, and the sole location that didn't feel like the scene of a crime was my grandfather's cabin on Lake Willow. Ezra Henley acquired 40 acres of what was locally known as Frog Pond in 1951 for $800. His entire discharge bonus after serving in Korea, the consensus was that he was out of his mind. The lake was then a scant 12 acres, closer to a marsh than a place for swimming. But Ezra possessed the type of foresight that is born from enduring frozen trenches and communist opposition. He constructed everything by hand using surplus Navy timber and pure determination. The cabin was first, followed by the dock, and then his crowning achievement, a 70-foot bridge that linked our land to the primary hiking trail. Every beam was personally chosen and set with the accuracy of a man who knew that careless work could lead to fatalities. No permits were necessary back in 1952. The county office was just a single fellow named Earl operating from his kitchen. The bridge achieved legendary status, children leaped from it each summer, and 3 generations witnessed marriage proposals on its weathered planks. By 2019, the Historical Society was advocating for its protection on the state registry. The cabin retained the smell of cedar shavings and Maxwell House coffee, just as it did during childhood trips when my grandpa would show me how to tie fishing knots under the glow of a lamp. Each weekend, I would flee my hollow-sounding apartment for a 2-hour drive through mountain roads to find blessed quiet. Then Hurricane Brenda arrived. Brenda Kelworth swept into our serene backwater 5 years ago like an escapee from a Phoenix country club, with designer everything from her whitened teeth to her imported Range Rover. She professed to have money from real estate, although no one ever witnessed evidence apart from her American Express black card. In under 6 months, she had acquired the old Henderson Ranch on the other side of the lake and revealed plans for Willow Shores Estates, with luxury homes beginning at $800,000 in a county where educators earned $35,000. The HOA was established quicker than mold in a damp cellar, and Brenda appointed herself president before the initial foundation was even laid. Her crown jewel was the Lake Vista Resort and Marina, a $2 million structure of glass, steel, and enough Italian marble to resurface Rome. Brenda's pastime was wielding municipal codes as weapons against anyone whose way of life clashed with her aesthetic preferences. The Kowalski family's chicken coop was deemed an agricultural nuisance in a residential area. Old Pete's fishing hut was an unpermitted building that presented a safety risk. Every infraction was accompanied by fines that, coincidentally, financed further HOA enhancements. My grandfather's bridge was obstructing the premium views from her resort cabins. You can't have guests paying $300 a night for a rustic lake experience seeing actual history. The ambush occurred on October 15th, as I was laying my father to rest just 300 meters away. Cancer had consumed him in a mere 6 weeks, a journey from diagnosis to funeral that felt like some macabre illusion. I had been dozing in hospital chairs and then submerged in paperwork, left utterly empty by sorrow on Sunday evening. I drove back, yearning for the lake's tranquility. Instead, yellow tape fluttered where 70 years of family heritage had once stood. The air was thick with the scent of diesel fumes and betrayal. Wood fragments were scattered like bone shards across the earth. which crunched under my feet like shattered aspirations. Affixed to my door was a notice. Unpermitted structure removed per Municipal Code 847B. Cleanup fees $2,847. Have a blessed day, Willow Shores HOA. Security camera footage uncovered the reality. At 7 a.m. sharp, Brenda was there, directing the excavator like a suburban dictator, indicating precisely where to make the cuts. She had on her red-high heels, the pair she saved for town council meetings and property takedowns. On Tuesday night, I gate-crashed their HOA meeting. There were 23 individuals crammed into a room designed for 15, the atmosphere heavy with hairspray and self-righteousness. "Mr. Henley?" Brenda stated without glancing up from her leather-bound portfolio. "Your rustic aesthetic is simply not in line with the community's standards. That bridge was an eyesore that lowered the value of adjacent properties. That bridge was constructed by a veteran of the Korean War. Without permits," she retorted with a smile as frigid as the lake's ice in January. To be blunt, it was obstructing our guests' view of the natural scenery. The vote was 7-2. I was liable for the cleanup costs as I drove home. My headlights illuminated new survey stakes along my property's edge, each branded with Brenda's company logo. Those stakes plagued my sleep for precisely 3 days, and then Brenda set her legal attack dog on me. Wednesday's certified mail made my morning coffee taste of pure animosity. It was a cease and desist order from Kelworth and Associates Legal, which I discovered was run by Brenda's son-in-law, Dale, a recent graduate from some diploma mill, eager to prove his worth. The list of accusations was like something from poorly written fiction. Criminal trespassing, harassment of board members, and my favorite, verbal assault and intimidation for having the audacity to speak at a public forum. However, the fourth paragraph was the true blow. My boat launch was in violation of setback regulations and was scheduled for demolition within 30 days. My boat launch, the very concrete ramp my grandpa Ezra had poured in 1953, long before Dale was even a glimmer of disappointment in his father's eye. Thursday delivered a lien notice that caused my hands to tremble. $2,800 in unpaid HOA fines levied against a property I had owned for longer than Brenda had resided in the state. The scent of legal documents and despair permeated my kitchen as I reread the same threat 3 times. Hoping for the words to alter, that afternoon, I went to the law office of Ruby Martinez, a renovated Victorian house that groaned like old bones with each footstep. Ruby was the type of small-town attorney who answered her own phone and didn't bill you for the time she spent thinking. "Water rights?" she declared, laying my grandfather's deed out on her desk. The aged, yellowed papers rustled like dry leaves as she traced the property boundaries with her finger. Most people are unaware of what they truly possess. The tale emerged like a suspense novel I had never known. In 1951, Lake Willow was a 12-acre, murky fishing spot, but 2 years on, federal funds for flood control reshaped it into a 47-acre tourist haven. The county erected a concrete dam on Ezra's property, put in spillways, and fashioned what was now advertised in brochures as a pristine mountain recreational area. Here was the detail that ignited my engineer's mind. Ezra had given an easement for the dam but had kept his ownership rights. Ruby produced a law book hefty enough to halt a bullet and clarified a concept known as riparian doctrine, a sophisticated way of saying that owners of lakefront property have special rights that can trump almost all more recent regulations. "Your grandfather was more astute than anyone gave him credit for," Ruby commented, pushing up her reading glasses. "He didn't just purchase land, he purchased authority." I was still trying to grasp this new information when Brenda chose to move from legal intimidation to outright vandalism. On Friday morning, I found that my boat dock had been tampered with. The support posts were sawn through with meticulous precision. My aluminum fishing boat was listing like an inebriated sailor, taking on water through newly formed stress cracks. The metallic flavor of fury filled my mouth as I inspected the clean incisions. It was a professional job, carried out in the dead of night. My security camera revealed the story. The lens had been spray-painted black around midnight. Brenda had a documented alibi, a wine and cheese event for her lake beautification committee that lasted until 11:30. The timing was impeccable, the cover perfect. But even small-town offenders make errors. Saturday afternoon saw the arrival of an unannounced guest. Jake Morrison, 22 and burdened with community college debt, appeared at my door, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. The young man handled marina maintenance for Brenda and needed the income for his pregnant girlfriend. but it seemed he still possessed a working conscience. "Mr. Henley," he murmured, casting nervous glances around as if Brenda might materialize from the pine woods. "I didn't damage your dock, but I saw Dale's truck near your place around 2 a.m. on Friday. I heard power tools." Jake then showed me a text message that connected all the dots. "Discreet dock repair needed ASAP. $500 bonus for completion over the weekend. No questions asked." It was classic Brenda. Create the issue, then capitalize on the solution. The woman had elevated extortion to a fine art. While I was busy documenting saw marks and taking pictures of the damage, Ruby was delving deeper into the state's archives. What she unearthed was invaluable. The 1954 environmental assessment, which was mandatory for the federal dam funding, included provisions for emergency drainage rights for the landowner. In simple terms, if Ezra's heir, which was me, decided the dam required an inspection or upkeep, I had the legal power to drain the entire lake. The county engineer's approval was needed, but he could not overrule my safety concerns. Ruby laid it all out for me over coffee that had the taste of success. "Marcus, your grandfather, equipped himself with a nuclear option. If someone jeopardizes the lake's integrity, you can pull the plug." The beautiful irony was not lost on me. Brenda had raised my bridge to enhance the view from her resort, but that very view was completely reliant on water that was under my control. On Sunday evening, I stood on my damaged dock, observing Brenda's sunset cruise making its way back to her marina. There were 12 guests enjoying champagne, their laughter carrying across the water that existed solely at my discretion. The soft lapping of the waves against the tilted support posts had an almost melodic quality. Jake's phone vibrated with his task for Monday. "Prepare guest boats for morning fishing excursions. Weather looks perfect." I smiled for the first time in weeks, recalling something Ruby had mentioned about old water law cases from her law school days. It seems that when it comes to riparian rights, the original property deed typically supersedes everything that follows. HOA rules, municipal laws, and even federal statutes, provided your ownership came first. The weather was indeed about to undergo a significant change. Monday morning dawned with the kind of crisp October atmosphere that encourages a belief in new beginnings. That feeling of hope lasted only until I inspected my dock. The job had been completed overnight by someone. My aluminum boat was now fully submerged, with just the tip of its bow showing above the water like a metal gravestone. The last of the dock posts had been severed, leaving sharp, wooden stumps sticking out from the lake bed. This time, however, our vandal had been careless. Fresh tire tracks ran from the access road down to my shoreline. Broad, high-end treads that bore a striking resemblance to those on Dale's oversized truck. Even more revealing were the cigarette butts left near the water's edge. Marlboro Reds, the same brand I had seen Dale chain smoking outside the HOA meetings. The security camera was still useless, its lens coated in black paint as thick as a guilty conscience. But criminals, even the suburban kind, invariably leave a trail. I was taking photos of the tire tracks when Jake materialized from the morning mist like a skittish apparition. The young man looked as though he hadn't slept, likely having lost a battle with his conscience. "Mr. Henley," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't continue with this. Last night, around 3 a.m., I saw Dale's truck driving away from your property. When I got to work this morning, Miss Kelworth offered me a $500 bonus for some discreet marina maintenance." Just then, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Brenda. "Dock repairs completed successfully. Excellent work. Bonus deposited." The woman had just admitted to a conspiracy through digital means. I almost pitied how inept criminals had become. That afternoon, as Ruby was filing police reports concerning the vandalism, I began my own deep dive into the history of Lake Willow. The basement of the county courthouse had the scent of old paper and long-held secrets. Exactly the sort of environment where truth seeks refuge from the light. What I discovered in the environmental files from 1954 altered the entire situation. The original dam construction had needed federal clearance, as it utilized Army Corps of Engineers flood control funds. However, concealed within subsection 12 of the environmental impact study was wording that made my engineer's heart race. The project required permanent public access to be maintained to validate the investment of taxpayer money. Crucially, the easement agreement laid out specific clauses for emergency drainage. If the dam's owner had doubts about its structural soundness, a full drainage was permitted for the purpose of inspection and upkeep. The county engineer was required to review such a decision, but federal law stipulated that he could not overrule genuine safety concerns. I recalled Ruby mentioning water law in our initial consultation, how she had specialized in it after seeing too many small property owners bullied by developers. She had clarified that original riparian rights often have precedence over more recent regulations. Zoning laws, HOA rules, and even city ordinances, the legal foundation was straightforward. First in time, first in right. Tuesday brought Brenda's most audacious maneuver yet. She arrived at my doorstep dressed in her finest, concerned citizen attire, pearls, crisply pressed trousers, and a smile that could freeze over hell. Flanking her were two resort guests who appeared to have been lifted straight from a country club advertisement, all gleaming teeth and a sense of superiority. "Marcus," she began, her voice laden with feigned sweetness, "we must address your recent conduct. My guests are feeling threatened by all this animosity. The animosity was simply my presence on my own land. I am ready to present a generous proposition," she went on, holding out an envelope as thick as a telephone directory. "For $100,000 in cash for your entire property. That's 40% more than its market value." I took the envelope and opened it. A cashier's check from a legitimate bank. It was enough to begin a new life elsewhere. The aroma of new ink and desperation rose from it like incense at a corrupt ceremony. "That's quite generous, Brenda. But this land is not for sale." Her facade cracked just enough to reveal the predator lurking beneath. "Marcus, you are waging a battle you are destined to lose. I possess resources, influence, and legal might. What do you have? A dilapidated cabin and wounded pride." "I have something superior," I replied, my mind on the federal documents on my kitchen table. "I have time." After their departure, I phoned Ruby to inform her about the federal compliance stipulations. Her excitement was almost tangible over the line. "Marcus, this is far more significant than vandalism or HOA conflicts. If Brenda's resort is in breach of federal access regulations, she is liable for repaying the original flood control funds, plus 70 years of interest." That evening, I stood at the spot where my grandfather's bridge once crossed the water, observing Brenda's evening wine cruise heading back to the marina. This time, there were 15 guests, their laughter carrying across a body of water that now felt different. Not as something I simply lived next to, but as something I held power over. The lake's surface mirrored the setting sun like liquid copper, beautiful and misleading, much like Brenda's enterprise. Stunning on the outside, but corrupt within. I took out my phone and dialed Pat Kowalski, the county engineer. If I intended to use my emergency drainage rights, I required official backing that would be irrefutable later. "Pat, it's Marcus Henley. I believe we should discuss the structural integrity of the Lake Willow Dam. When would be a good time for you to come for an inspection?" The situation was about to become very dynamic. Wednesday morning, Pat Kowalski, clipboard in hand, was at my front door. County engineers are a distinct type. Systematic, meticulous, and immune to being hurried. Pat had been inspecting dams since the Carter administration, and his calloused hands spoke of concrete and water in ways most people could never grasp. "Marcus," he began, settling his hard hat against the morning light, "Ruby informed me you have some worries about the structural integrity. Let's have a look." We traversed the dam's length together, Pat recording measurements as I supplied historical records. The concrete appeared sturdy from the surface, but 70 years of relentless water pressure and the cycle of freezing and thawing had left their mark. Fine cracks webbed across the spillway walls, resembling wrinkles on an aged face. "Siltation is the major issue," Pat noted, indicating the murky water near the marina. "All the boat activity churns up the bottom sediment more quickly than the lake can naturally handle it." His soil analysis revealed a narrative that made my anger rise. There were heavy metals from fuel spills, chemical traces from hull cleaning agents, and a sufficient amount of petroleum byproducts to label parts of the lakebed as hazardous material. The resort's fast boats and jet skis had converted 47 acres of mountain water into a poisonous concoction. Federal regulations suggest regular drainage for man-made lakes. Pat went on, jotting down notes that would alter everything. "It clears out accumulated contaminants and allows for natural sediment movement. This should have been addressed 15 years ago." That afternoon, as Pat was putting together his official findings, Brenda initiated her most savage assault. Flyers began to appear all over. On telephone poles, in shop windows, and on car windshields, spreading like a suburban contagion, my divorce photograph was plastered on every surface. accompanied by carefully chosen excerpts from court records that portrayed me as a dangerously unstable individual. Dangerous local threatens lake community. The headline blared in 72-point type. Beneath it, meticulously edited quotes from my custody dispute depicted me as an emotionally volatile father with a history of anger management and substance abuse problems. The substance abuse was my admission to drinking excessively during my divorce, and the anger management was a standard requirement in any contested custody case. With all context removed, the truth had been contorted into weaponized lies. My phone began to ring before midday. It was neighbors, friends, and even my ex-wife, Sarah, calling from Denver to inquire about what was happening. The feeling of shame was like copper coins and burnt coffee in my mouth, coating my throat with an undeserved humiliation. But Brenda had made a crucial error. Thursday morning, Sheriff Deputy Williams, a quietly spoken man who had known my family since I was a child, knocked on my door. He was holding one of the flyers, his face a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "Marcus, I need to ask, did you authorize the publication of these court documents?" "Absolutely not. Those records are meant to be sealed." "That's what I assumed." He folded the flyer with care, as if it were a piece of evidence. "The unauthorized release of sealed court documents is a felony, as is harassment intended to harm someone's reputation. Do you wish to file a complaint?" While Deputy Williams began his inquiry, I came across something that would cause Brenda's legal woes to proliferate like germs in still water. Pat's official report came in on Friday afternoon, stamped and notarized with the weight of 40 years of expertise. His findings were clear. Lake Willow Dam is structurally sound but is in need of urgent environmental cleanup. I recommend a temporary drainage within 60 days to clear out the built-up toxins and re-establish the ecosystem's balance. The environmental justification provided me with legal protection that was unassailable. But Pat's investigation had revealed something even more potent. Federal permit infractions that would torpedo Brenda's entire enterprise. "Marcus," Pat said over coffee that tasted of sweet victory, "that marina was constructed without the necessary wetland impact assessments. Federal law mandates an environmental review for any building that affects water systems. She never submitted the required documents." I recalled reading about this during my own research, something Ruby had termed successor liability. When a property is sold, the new owners take on all federal permit responsibilities. The previous owner's oversights become the current owner's legal catastrophe. What does that mean in real terms? She is liable for the repayment of the original 1954 flood control funds, plus penalties. The current amount, with interest, is around $850,000. On Friday evening, I stood at my property's edge, observing Brenda's latest wine cruise as it returned to the marina. There were 20 guests this time, their laughter drifting across a body of water that now felt different, not as something I simply lived next to, but as something I completely controlled. The irony was exquisite. Brenda had demolished my grandfather's bridge to enhance her view, oblivious to the fact that the view was entirely dependent on the water I owned. She had used municipal codes and legal threats as weapons, unaware that I possessed federal authority that superseded any move she could make. My phone vibrated with a text from Jake. "Weekend is fully booked. Fishing tournament Saturday, wedding reception Sunday, a big money weekend for the resort." I smiled, thinking of something my grandfather used to say about patience being a hunter's most valuable tool. He had learned that principle in the mountains of Korea, biding his time for the opportune moment to act. That perfect moment was fast approaching. Saturday was set to bring journalists, federal agents, and a sufficient number of onlookers to guarantee that Brenda's demise would be a public affair rather than a personal act of revenge. Saturday morning dawned with a kind of sharp clarity that makes keeping secrets an impossibility. I was going over Pat's environmental report for the third time when a call from Ruby altered the entire situation. "Marcus, you need to come down to my office immediately." When I got there 20 minutes later, her office had the aroma of burnt coffee and legal victory. Laid out on her desk were photocopied papers that appeared to have been salvaged from a fire, yellowed and fragile, yet clear enough to ruin lives. My paralegal discovered these in the basement of the state archives. Ruby explained, her voice trembling with excitement. "Filed under federal compliance. Lake projects 1950 to 1960. No one has touched this box in 4 decades. The documents revealed a narrative that made my hands tremble. The lake expansion in 1954 hadn't merely utilized federal flood control funds. It was a component of an extensive Army Corps of Engineers initiative that covered 3 counties. The financing came with conditions that would suffocate Brenda's entire operation. Examine Section 7, Ruby urged, indicating a clause that was a legal bombshell. Any commercial enterprise that impacts the federally funded water resource is required to uphold the original access agreements. If these agreements are breached, the funds must be returned with compound interest. My engineer's mind began to race, calculating $800,000 in 1954, compounded annually for 70 years at federal rates. The resulting figure made my coffee taste like liquid gold. What are we talking about in terms of money? A conservative guess? 2-3 million. But here's the best part. It gets even better. Ruby produced a file labeled Wetland Permits Required and laid out its contents like a winning poker hand. Federal law stipulated that environmental impact studies were necessary for any marina construction that affected water resources. The paper trail should have been impeccable, but Brenda had never submitted it. She constructed a $2 million resort on federally protected water without the correct permits. Ruby stated, her grin, like that of a shark that has scented blood. That's more than just a fine. It's criminal negligence. The legal principle was known as successor liability. When Brenda acquired the Henderson Ranch and developed it into Willow Shores Estates, she took on every federal responsibility associated with the property. The previous owner's lack of compliance became her legal disaster, retroactive to the day she acquired the deed. But the most explosive revelation was concealed in subsection 12 of the initial agreement, Emergency Drainage Authority. Ruby read, her finger tracing the words that my grandfather had skillfully negotiated 70 years prior. If the dam owner finds that environmental contamination is threatening the integrity of the ecosystem, immediate drainage is permitted for cleanup purposes. Ezra had been far more shrewd than anyone had imagined. He had created for himself an ultimate deterrent, disguised within flood control documentation. She can challenge you in court for years, Ruby went on, but she cannot challenge federal environmental law. Pat's contamination report provides you with an unassailable reason for an emergency drainage. I thought of Brenda's weekend reservations, the fishing tournament, the wedding reception, amounting to $20,000 in resort income that was dependent on perfect lake conditions. The timing was almost too ideal. There's more, Ruby added, holding up a manila envelope that smelled of basement mold and legal high explosives. Private investigator has unearthed some intriguing financial documents. Brenda's enterprise was financed by debt. The resort was burdened with $1,800,000 in construction loans, with monthly repayments that were higher than its off-season income. Any interruption to business lasting 60 days would activate bankruptcy clauses. However, the environmental infractions left her open to something far more severe than bankruptcy: federal confiscation. If the Army Corps establishes that there were deliberate permit violations, Ruby clarified, they are authorized to seize the property until it is brought into compliance. She would lose everything: the resort, the marina, and even her own home if it is linked to the business loans. The irony was so exquisite it seemed to make my grandfather's spirit smile. Brenda had demolished his bridge to secure her view, never grasping that the view was entirely at my mercy. She had used municipal codes and legal threats as weapons, oblivious to the fact that I held a federal authority that overshadowed anything she could muster. My phone vibrated with a message from Jake. Saturday fishing tournament kicks off at sunrise, the biggest event of the year. Miss Kelworth is anticipating record earnings. I looked at Ruby, then at the papers that would signal the end of Brenda's oppressive rule. How long do we need to give notice for the drainage? A minimum of 72 hours for an emergency environmental cleanup. Then we'll file on Monday morning. Let her enjoy one final, perfect weekend before her lake vanishes. Justice, as it happened, possessed a timing as meticulous as a Swiss watch. Monday morning felt like the prelude to a major operation. Ruby's office had been converted into a command center, with legal papers covering every available space and enough coffee to keep a small battalion going. First things first, Ruby announced, adjusting her glasses over a pile of federal documents. We file the notice for emergency environmental remediation. Pat's contamination report provides us with an ironclad basis. Pat Kowalski showed up at 9 a.m. on the dot, carrying a briefcase that rattled with soil sample containers and the weight of decades of dam inspection knowledge. His weathered hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as he presented the technical evidence that would warrant the draining of 47 acres of Poison Lake water. The levels of contamination are higher than my initial findings, Pat stated, pointing to lab results that read like an ecological nightmare. Heavy metals, petroleum residue, chemical spills from boat upkeep. This water has been slowly poisoning the ecosystem for years. I went over the technical details as Pat outlined the drainage plan. The original 1953 system was manually operated, needing no electricity, just physical effort, mechanical advantage, and the kind of engineering accuracy that veterans of the Korean War deeply understood. It's a three-step process, Pat explained, drawing on Ruby's whiteboard. The warning valve is opened first, lowering the level by 6 inches an hour. This gives the fish time to move to deeper sections. Then, a slow release over another 12 hours drains the main part of the lake. Lastly, a complete evacuation through the emergency spillway. The entire procedure would last between 18 and 24 hours, giving enough time for wildlife to be rescued but not enough for Brenda to get a court order from her team of paid-for lawyers. Jake Morrison became our informant, though the young man looked as if he might be sick with anxiety each time we went over the strategy. His girlfriend was 7 months pregnant, and the loss of his marina job would be a financial disaster for them. Yet, his conscience had ultimately triumphed over his financial needs. The weekend is completely booked, Jake informed us, anxiously checking his phone for any messages from Brenda. There's a fishing tournament on Saturday, a corporate event on Sunday, and a wedding reception on Sunday evening. She's counting on $30,000 in earnings. Ruby managed the legal documentation with the skill of someone who had spent 30 years outwitting larger legal firms. Federal environmental notifications, county drainage authorizations, and liability disclaimers that would shield us from legal action when Brenda's enterprise fell apart in the mud. The great thing about Emergency Environmental Authority, Ruby clarified as she notarized the documents, is that it takes precedence over nearly everything else. Zoning regulations, HOA rules, even initial court orders. None of that is relevant when federal contamination limits have been breached. I recalled her mentioning a case from her law school days where a dairy farmer had managed to drain a contaminated pond despite resistance from 3 different towns and a state environmental body. The crucial elements were thorough documentation and irrefutable scientific evidence. Pat's contamination report supplied both. Tuesday saw the arrival of unexpected support. Dr. Sarah Olivia from the State Wildlife Agency came with a truckload of temporary tanks and a sufficient number of volunteers to move every fish in the lake. News of our ecosystem restoration effort had circulated within environmental groups. We've been eager to examine the contamination in Lake Willow for years, Dr. Olivia commented, analyzing water samples that would serve as compelling evidence in a federal case. The resort's boat traffic has pushed the pollution past the point of natural recovery. A temporary drainage is precisely what this ecosystem requires. The fish rescue would create the ideal pretext for media coverage. Environmental restoration always presents better on television than property disagreements or stories of HOA retaliation. On Wednesday evening, I patrolled the dam's length with a flashlight, inspecting the mechanisms that my grandfather had kept up until his death. The manual crank system was ingeniously straightforward, a tribute to 1950s engineering that valued practicality over intricacy. WD-40 and 70 years of diligent upkeep had ensured everything was in working order. The scent of machine oil and lake water mingled with a sense of anticipation as I checked each part. Warning valve. Functional, main release. Operating smoothly, emergency spillway. Prepared to engulf 47 acres of polluted water. My phone buzzed with news from our expanding team. Ruby had reached out to an environmental journalist from the state's main newspaper, framing the story as a heroic lake restoration effort against greedy developers. Dr. Olivia confirmed that the fish rescue teams would be there on Friday afternoon. Pat had arranged for county emergency services to be coordinated on Saturday morning. Everything was coming together with the precision of a well-oiled machine, designed by someone who knew that timing is more critical than brute force. On Thursday night, I sat in my grandfather's cabin, reading his maintenance records by the light of a lamp. His last entry, from 3 weeks before he passed away, brought a lump to my throat. The lake holds the memory of its natural condition. One day, someone will help it rediscover that memory. Ezra had foreseen this day. He had maintained the drainage authority. Not merely as a legal last resort, but as an environmental imperative. The lake had to breathe, to cleanse itself of the poison that had built up over decades, to recall the sensation of clean water. Friday was set to bring news crews, federal agents, and enough onlookers to guarantee that Brenda's demise would be a public affair rather than a personal act of revenge. Saturday would unleash a torrent of justice, like 47 acres of liberated water. Friday morning was shattered like glass on concrete when Brenda made her most audacious move yet. I was conducting a final test of the dam's warning valve when 3 black SUVs entered my driveway. Resembling a suburban military operation, out came Brenda, her lawyer son-in-law Dale, and 2 men in tactical attire who looked as though they had been lifted from a military contractor's brochure. Marcus Henley, the lead contractor, a man with a chiseled face and biceps that strained his polo shirt, announced, "I'm Rick Stevenson from Northwood Security. We are here to stop any terrorist acts against vital infrastructure." Terrorist acts? The woman had actually labeled me a terrorist for using my legal rights on my own land. "This dam is essential for the water security of the entire community," Brenda proclaimed, placing herself between me and the dam's controls like a suburban commander. "Your threatened act of sabotage is considered domestic terrorism under the Patriot Act." Dale then presented an emergency injunction, as thick as a phone book, a federal court order that prohibits any interference with the community's water supply. A violation of this order results in a 10-year federal prison sentence. I looked over the documents, my blood pressure rising to alarming levels. The injunction appeared genuine, with an impressive letterhead and a judicial seal, and enough legal jargon to baffle a lawyer. But something felt off, like the faint smell of old fish wrapped in legal papers. "This is dated yesterday," I noted, pointing at the filing time. "How did you manage to get a federal judge to approve emergency orders in just 18 hours? Dale's confident expression wavered slightly, like a candle in a breeze. "Judge Morrison is a close family friend." He recognized the seriousness of the situation. Judge Morrison, Jake's uncle. The pieces fell into place like tumblers in a lock, revealing the corruption within. That afternoon, as Brenda's hired guns set up a security line around my dam, Ruby initiated a legal counteroffensive that would have impressed a military strategist. "Marcus, this injunction is a fake," she declared, waving the paper as if it were a white flag. "Judge Morrison retired last month. He has no legal power to issue federal directives." But Ruby had found something even more damning than forged documents. Her inquiry into Brenda's financial dealings had revealed a trail that led directly to federal prison. "Your acquaintance Brenda has been paying off county officials for years," Ruby went on, laying out bank statements on her desk like evidence in a murder case. "Building permits, environmental exemptions, zoning changes. She purchased them all, including that fraudulent injunction. The FBI takes federal corruption very seriously, particularly when it concerns infrastructure and environmental regulations." Ruby's call to the regional office had set off an investigation that would cause Brenda's legal problems to multiply like cancer. In the meantime, Northwood Security was discovering that private security firms have no jurisdiction on private land. Sheriff Deputy Williams showed up on Friday evening with reinforcements and a very direct message. "Ms. Kelworth, you are on private property. Your men must leave at once or they will be arrested." "But the federal injunction is a worthless piece of paper signed by a retired judge," Deputy Williams cut in. "Pack up your toy soldiers and get off Mr. Henley's property." The contractors vanished like a puff of smoke, leaving Brenda standing by herself in my driveway with a look that could make milk go sour. Her empire was collapsing, and she was well aware of it. Saturday morning brought the media frenzy I had anticipated: environmental journalists, local news teams, and enough cameras to shoot a major film. Dr. Olivia's fish rescue effort made for perfect television. Volunteers and waiters were gently netting bass and bluegill, explaining the process of ecosystem restoration to captivated reporters. "This is environmental terrorism," Brenda yelled at anyone holding a microphone, her composure finally shattering like brittle paint. "He is ruining our lake to fulfill some personal grudge." But the journalists had done their research: Pat's contamination report, the federal permit breaches, and Brenda's history of municipal corruption presented a starkly different narrative. "Miss Kelworth," the environmental correspondent from Channel 7 asked, What is your response to the claims that your resort has been unlawfully discharging pollutants into federally protected waters? Brenda's reply contained several words that would need to be censored for television broadcast. By midday, federal agents had arrived to investigate the permit violations that Ruby had brought to light. Agent Patricia Hayes from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division had the demeanor of someone who had dedicated her career to bringing environmental offenders to justice. "Mr. Henley," Agent Hayes stated after examining Pat's contamination findings, "your drainage operation is not only within the law, it is environmentally essential. This lake has been poisoned for years." The fishing tournament went on as planned, although the contestants kept complaining that the water smelled of diesel and tasted of industrial waste. Brenda's perfect weekend was disintegrating like sugar in acid rain. Jake sent me updates all day. Resort guests were demanding their money back, the wedding party was threatening legal action over the contaminated location, and Ms. Kelworth was holed up in her office, shouting at her lawyers on Sunday evening. I stood at the dam's controls, watching Brenda's last wine cruise return to a marina that was on its last legs. 22 guests were sipping champagne over water that would be gone in 18 hours, their laughter echoing across a 47-acre environmental crime scene. The manual crank was smooth in my hand, a product of 70 years of diligent upkeep, ready to unleash decades of pent-up justice. Monday morning was set to bring a deluge. Not of water, but of repercussions. Sunday night saw Brenda's last, desperate move, one that would have earned Machiavelli's admiration for its sheer nerve and his contempt for its utter lack of integrity. My phone rang at 11:30 p.m. It was Sarah's number, my ex-wife, calling from Denver at that hour, could only mean an emergency or a disaster. Considering the recent turn of events, I braced for the worst. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice was strained with anger and something else. Apprehension. "I just had a very peculiar visitor. A woman who said she was from a family advocacy group offered me $50,000 to state that you are an unfit parent." The metallic taste of fury filled my mouth as Sarah recounted the details of her visitor. A blonde woman, well-dressed, in a white Range Rover with Colorado license plates, Brenda had made a 6-hour drive to Denver to personally direct this character assassination. She had copies of our divorce papers, custody reports, and even pictures of you. At the lake, Sarah went on, she claimed you were emotionally unstable and a threat to the community's safety. She wanted me to seek an emergency modification of our custody agreement to stop you from engaging in dangerous activities. The strategy was devilishly straightforward. An emergency custody hearing on Monday morning would necessitate my being in a Denver family court. This would cause me to miss the deadline for the drainage, buying Brenda time to bring in genuine federal authorities. By the time I got back, her legal team would have every environmental agency in 3 states bogged down with court orders. I recorded the entire exchange, Sarah said, and I could detect a smile in her voice. This woman admitted to attempting to bribe a witness in a federal inquiry. She is facing felony conspiracy charges. My ex-wife and I may have been divorced, but she had never lost her moral compass. In spite of our issues, Sarah knew I was a good father and a decent person. More importantly, she detested bullies who used children as pawns in adult disputes. "Send that recording to Ruby Martinez right away," I told her. "And Sarah, I appreciate it." Monday dawned with the kind of sharp clarity that makes keeping secrets an impossibility. I was at the dam by 5 a.m., running a final check on the systems as news crews took up positions around the lake like war reporters covering a military action. Ruby showed up with federal documents that shone like legal protection in the early morning light. EPA clearance for an emergency environmental cleanup, Army Corps of Engineers permission for the dam's operation, and enough liability disclaimers to shield us from any lawsuit Brenda's legal team could dream up. "The FBI is requesting Brenda's bribery recording," Ruby informed me, adjusting her glasses over papers that were set to end careers. "Agent Hayes says it's proof of a federal conspiracy to impede an environmental investigation." At 6 a.m., Pat Kowalski arrived with his official county engineer's authorization. Olivia came with her fish rescue teams and a sufficient amount of scientific reasoning to silence even the most zealous environmental lawyer. Everything was perfectly lawful, thoroughly documented, and utterly ruinous to Brenda's enterprise. The media narrative had already evolved from a local land disagreement to a story of environmental renewal versus corporate malfeasance. National news vans were lined up on the access road like metal birds of prey, their satellite dishes aimed at the sky like modern-day totems. At 7 a.m., Brenda had her final meltdown. She showed up at the dam in her night clothes and a fur coat, her hair as wild as a scarecrow's, yelling threats that would need significant censoring for television broadcast. Trailing behind her were Dale and two environmental lawyers who looked as if they would rather be anywhere else in the world. "You can't do this," she shrieked at the gathered press. "This is my lake, my investment, my life's work." "Actually," I interjected, holding up the original 1951 deed for the cameras to capture. "This is my grandfather's lake. You've merely been using it." Agent Hayes came forward with a pair of handcuffs that glinted like jewels in the morning light. "Brenda Kelworth, you are being arrested for conspiracy to bribe federal witnesses, obstruction of an environmental investigation, and violation of federal water protection laws." The spectacle of Brenda being forced into the back of an FBI vehicle, dressed in designer pajamas and shouting about property rights, would have been highly amusing if it weren't so tragic. At 8 a.m., the moment I had anticipated since October arrived. I put my hand on the manual crank that my grandfather had installed 70 years before. The metal was warm to the touch, warmed by the morning sun and decades of diligent upkeep. Around me, cameras clicked like a swarm of mechanical insects, documenting history. "This drainage is not about revenge," I announced to the assembled journalists, my thoughts on Pat's contamination findings and Olivia's ecosystem report. "It's about renewal. Sometimes you have to completely empty something to make it clean again." The warning valve opened with a resounding clang that echoed across the 47 acres of polluted water. The lake's level began to fall instantly, by 6 inches an hour, just as my grandfather Ezra had intended. Behind me, Brenda's resort guests were realizing that their opulent weekend had turned into an environmental disaster film. Boats were stranded on the newly exposed mudflats, swimming pools were cracking as the water pressure balanced out, and million-dollar investments were being seized as federal evidence. Justice, as it turned out, flowed just like water. Slowly at first and then in a sudden torrent. The change began instantly. By 10 a.m., Lake Willow's water level had receded by 3 feet, revealing decades of environmental offenses that Brenda's immaculate surface had concealed like cosmetics on a decaying face. The first items to appear from the dwindling waters were a collection of boat batteries, dozens of them strewn across the muddy floor like poisonous headstones. Following that came oil barrels, chemical drums, and enough petroleum residue to be designated a federal Superfund site. "Good heavens," murmured the environmental reporter from Channel 7, capturing the disastrous scene on camera while fighting the urge to gag from the smell. "This isn't a lake. It's a toxic waste site." Agent Hayes and her EPA crew descended upon the exposed lakebed like forensic experts at a crime scene, collecting soil samples and documenting evidence that would ensure Brenda spent the remainder of her days in a federal prison. The level of contamination was far worse than Pat's initial assessment had suggested. Decades of resort activity, with everything from kitchen waste to boat fuel being discharged directly into federally protected waters. Midday brought the most satisfying television I had ever witnessed. Brenda's million-dollar yachts were now listing at odd angles in the mud, resembling beached sea creatures, their once gleaming hulls caked in a black sludge that smelled of industrial rot. Guests at the resort stood on the marina's deck, holding champagne flutes and gazing out at a 47-acre environmental crime scene. The wedding party showed up at 1 p.m. for their lakeside celebration, only to find that their picturesque location had transformed into a lunar-like landscape. The bride, a pharmaceutical heiress from Phoenix, took a single look at the desolate scene and began shouting at Dale about legal action and shattered dreams. "Ma'am," I called out from the dam controls, "I can suggest several good lawyers, although you might want to steer clear of anyone with the surname Kelworth." By 2 p.m., the media frenzy had captured the nation's interest. CNN's environmental unit arrived with satellite vans and sufficient camera gear to produce a full-length documentary. The story had all the elements: corporate malfeasance, ecological ruin, federal offenses, and a lone individual's battle to uphold his grandfather's heritage. Mr. Henley, the CNN correspondent, a sharp-witted woman who had made her name uncovering environmental criminals, called out, "There are those who claim you are destroying the lake as an act of personal vengeance. What is your response?" I motioned towards the exposed contamination, where EPA agents were documenting evidence of crimes that spanned decades. Ma'am, the only thing that was being destroyed here was concealed beneath 20 feet of water. We are not draining the lake. We are uncovering the crime scene. The statement landed with the force of a thunderclap. At 3 p.m., Sheriff Deputy Williams arrived with a warrant for Dale's arrest. He had been discovered hiding in the resort's wine cellar with a briefcase of cash and forged environmental permits. The sight of Brenda's son-in-law being led away in handcuffs, past his now-ruined marina, as wedding guests demanded their money back, was pure television gold. At 4 p.m., the full extent of Brenda's environmental devastation was revealed. As the water level fell below the marina's foundations, workers found an unauthorized sewage pipe that was discharging resort waste directly into the lake. The EPA's mobile testing units went into overdrive, recording contamination levels that surpassed federal safety limits by such a margin that Agent Hayes had to call for more investigators. This is the most severe environmental crime I have witnessed in 20 years, Agent Hayes declared to the reporters, holding up soil samples that resembled toxic sludge. The individuals responsible will face federal charges, including conspiracy, environmental terrorism, and the deliberate endangerment of public water supplies. At 5 p.m., the moment I had awaited since October arrived, Dr. Olivia's fish rescue teams had successfully moved over 10,000 bass, bluegill, and trout to temporary holding facilities. The healthy fish would be returned to clean water, while the contaminated ones would serve as evidence in a federal court. At 6 p.m., the drainage was complete. The bed of Lake Willow was open to the sun for the first time in 70 years, uncovering not only environmental offenses but also historical relics from the original valley. Native American arrowheads, colonial-era agricultural implements, and parts of the original Willow Creek bed that my grandfather had safeguarded beneath the man-made lake. The sun setting over the empty lakebed cast a surreal light on a landscape that no camera could truly capture. 47 acres of exposed land lay between the mountains like a vast, ancient amphitheater, with Brenda's stranded resort overlooking it like a preposterous monument to avarice and folly. Local families came with metal detectors and fishing nets, their children running in the original creek bed that my grandfather Ezra had preserved for 7 decades. Older residents recounted tales of swimming in the natural springs before federal funding changed everything into a tourist attraction. My great-grandfather used to search for gold in this creek, remarked Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old whose family had been in the area since before it was a state. It hasn't seen the light of day since Eisenhower was in office. As night descended, I stood where my grandfather's bridge once crossed clean water, watching FBI agents catalog evidence under the glare of portable floodlights. The lake would naturally replenish from mountain springs and seasonal rains, clean water taking the place of polluted waste. Just as nature had intended, Brenda's empire had vanished like a morning haze, leaving nothing but mud and federal indictments in its wake. 30 days later, I was standing on my grandfather's newly constructed bridge, taking in the most beautiful sound imaginable. Clean water gently lapping against a natural bank, the lake had refilled gradually, nourished by mountain springs that shone like liquid diamonds in the morning light. The air was different now. The smell of diesel fuel and the chemical odor that had plagued the water for decades were gone. In their place was the fresh aroma of pine and clean water that I recalled from my childhood visits with Ezra. Brenda's legal woes had proliferated like rabbits in the spring. Federal conspiracy charges, environmental terrorism, bribery of public officials. The FBI had amassed a case that would keep her in an orange jumpsuit until she was old enough for Medicare. Dale was facing similar accusations. In addition to document forgery and obstruction of justice, they were both looking at 15 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The resort property was now deserted, slowly being taken over by nature as federal cleanup teams worked to reverse decades of ecological harm. Weeds were sprouting through the cracked marble floors where Brenda's wine-fueled gatherings once celebrated the taming of natural beauty. My restored bridge was inaugurated on Thanksgiving weekend with a gathering that attracted 300 people and a spread of homemade food sufficient to feed a small army. The scent of turkey and stuffing blended with the smell of pine needles and lake air as Mayor Patricia Collins revealed the bronze plaque. Ezra Henley Memorial Crossing, Korean War veteran, conservationist, protector of Lake Willow. The rebuilding process had been a community effort, Local builders gave up their weekends. The lumberyard offered materials at a reduced price, and volunteers came with coffee and a can-do attitude until the work was complete. Children who had never seen the original bridge helped to paint the railings and heard stories about the grandfather they had never known. My custody arrangement was resolved in the best possible way when Sarah's recording of Brenda's bribery offer was used as federal evidence. Judge Williams not only increased my visitation rights but also praised Sarah's honesty in court. My children now spend their entire summers at the lake, learning to fish in water that is clean enough to drink. The ecotourism that has replaced Brenda's artificial opulence has proven to be both long-lasting and lucrative. Anglers from 3 states come to catch bass in unpolluted waters. Families have found the joy of camping under the stars instead of beneath Italian marble. Local shops are flourishing, selling authentic mountain goods rather than imported resort merchandise. I have set up the Ezra Henley Conservation Scholarship, funded by the fees from my speaking engagements on water rights and environmental justice. The first to receive it was Jake Morrison's younger brother, Tommy, who aims to design systems for preventing pollution rather than just dealing with the aftermath. Jake himself is now an apprentice to Pat Kowalski, studying dam engineering under someone who believes that infrastructure should benefit communities, not corporations. The annual Bridge Festival every September brings in thousands of people to celebrate community spirit over commercialism. Local musicians perform on a stage made from salvaged resort wood. Children leap from the bridge just as their parents and grandparents did, carrying on traditions that Brenda, with all her wealth and lawyers, could not eradicate. Lake Willow has become a national example of environmental renewal. Engineering students come to learn about our drainage methods, and federal bodies use our project as evidence that ordinary citizens can successfully combat corporate pollution when they have legal knowledge and community backing. Ruby Martinez's law firm now takes on water rights cases in 4 states. Her triumph with federal environmental law has brought in clients who are engaged in similar struggles against developers who value profit over protection. She has never lost another water rights case, though she often says that nothing will ever match the experience of draining an entire lake in the name of justice. The recovery of the ecosystem has surpassed all scientific expectations. Fish numbers tripled in just 18 months. Dr. Olivia's studies have shown how a temporary drainage can rejuvenate damaged man-made lakes, offering a model for similar projects around the world. 6 months after the drainage, state environmental authorities declared Lake Willow a protected watershed under federal conservation initiatives, ensuring permanent safeguarding from commercial development, guaranteed public access, and funds for continuous monitoring. Ezra's dream finally has legal backing strong enough to deter any developers who might threaten his haven. Standing on the restored bridge this evening, watching the sunset color the clean water in shades of burnished copper, I can almost hear my grandfather's approving laugh carrying across the water that will stay pure long after my time. Some fights are worth having, not for the sake of personal triumph, but for the principles that endure beyond individual lives. Clean water, community respect, and honoring commitments to the generations to come. If you've been through your own HOA ordeal, please share your experience in the comments. The end for HOA community reads each and every one, and your story could inspire someone else to stand up for themselves. And if this tale has renewed your belief that regular people can still overcome corrupt systems when armed with truth and determination, please hit that subscribe button and become part of the HOA Stories family. Our journey is just beginning. Thank you for listening to HOA Stories, where ordinary people confront HOA Karens and justice is served. If you enjoyed this story, please click the like button, leave your comments below, and subscribe for more HOA adventures and real-life community conflicts each week.